Good morning, everybody. This is Scotty and Chris. We are here to talk about cybersecurity, and this is our weekly online mentorship webinar called CS-Sensei. Wanted to point out that this is a free program. It is for anyone who is interested in cybersecurity as a, let's say, a career decision or a career path. We provide information on the latest cybersecurity news. We talk about the mindset that's necessary to be successful in cybersecurity, and we can sort of talk about that just for a moment. The challenge we have in cybersecurity is the exact same tools and techniques that are used for people to become cybersecurity specialists and engineers and analysts are the exact same tools that are used to break into systems and organizations and networks and compromise data and, conduct ransomware attacks, etc. In other words, you could be training good workers as well as bad workers in the exact same class. So the challenge that we have is not only learning the techniques and that sort of thing, but also learning why we do it. Why is it important to have an ethical foundation for your cybersecurity approach rather than just, hey, cybersecurity is fun and I hear it pays well and I can do stuff like that. There has to be a reason why, and we help establish that strong foundation here with the CS-Sensei Mentorship Program. So this morning, and I think you all can see it on the screen, I wanted to talk about frameworks, but let's take a side trip off into ransomware. I was just trying to look around and get some information to pass on to everybody, and I did a quick search that said, hey, what companies have been hit by ransomware recently? And I arrived at this page from Heimdall Security. It's actually a blog page, but it's from Heimdall Security, heimdallsecurity.com. Cybersecurity ransomware, and it says more and more companies are getting hit with ransomware, and it says 2021 and 2022. So it points out that there are lots of people that are getting hit, and even more each time as time goes by. And then here's an interesting one statistic. It says, according to a study conducted by CloudWards, in 2021, 37% of all businesses and organizations were hit by ransomware. And out of those, 32% paid the ransom, but recovered only 65% of their data. An important thing to remember for ransomware is you are dealing with criminals. So, there is no honor in a ransomware transaction. If you, it is totally possible that somebody could hit your organization with ransomware and then demand, $300,000 or $1 million or whatever, and you pay the ransom and they say nothing else. They are totally gone after that. Okay. So ransomware is a never something that you should consider to be a business transaction. It's not. You're dealing with criminals. They have already committed a crime. So just be aware, if you're talking to your CEO or whatever, always bring up the risk. If you are sitting in a meeting and somebody discusses, well, maybe we could pay the ransomware. According to this latest study, of all the people that in 2021, of all the companies that were hit with ransomware, 32%, roughly a third, paid the ransomware and recovered 65% of their data. In other words, it's not a guarantee, and by far from it. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. Chris, did you have any comments based on that? This understanding?
Nailed all of it.
Yeah.
Nailed all of it.
The important thing to remember is ransomware payment is dicey business, and bring that up to your CEO, who may say, "What? I paid them." Well, you paid a bunch of thugs. Just don't expect that 100% of the time you're going to recover 100% of your data, even if you do pay 100% of the ransomware demands. There have been cases where somebody will make a ransomware payment, and they'll say, okay, well, here's part of the information. Here's how you can recover part of your information. Why? Because you just paid them, and it might be possible that you'll pay them again. They just upped the ante. If you think about it in terms of a poker game, they just said, okay, we'll see you and raise you $1 million. So just be aware that happens, and don't fall for it if you can possibly help it. Paying a ransomware demand gets into high-risk transactions with no promise of return. So here is an interesting list. It says private and public companies affected by ransomware attacks in 2021. And I'm just going to go down the list kind of slowly, but you notice, for example, Accenture, who is an accepted authority in IT, they've been hit by ransomware. Acer, the computer manufacturer, Bose, let's see some other ones. Hospitals, City of Tulsa, CNA Financial, Cox, the folks that deliver Cox Cable and Cox Media, yep. Dairy farms. Last year, you may remember last year, the FBI pointed out that farms and produce providing infrastructures were likely to see an increase in ransomware attacks and cyber attacks. Why? Because they were all modernizing their infrastructures and implementing new IT-based means of doing business. Well, when you implement new IT, that also includes new possible vulnerabilities, especially if you think of cybersecurity second. So just something to think about. As new technology is being implemented, you must immediately consider how to protect it. Okay? Fujifilm, Gigabyte, Howard University, let's see, JVC Kenwood, Kaseya, Lincoln College. Anyway, I think, Memorial Health System, that's a big health group hit by ransomware. And so, it's not just who you are, but it could be who you do business with. And so just be aware that ransomware is prevalent, very prevalent out there. And, oh, look, the San Francisco 49ers hit with ransomware. Probably a disgruntled Green Bay Packers fan. You just don't know. University of Colorado, UL, the Underwriters Laboratory. Have you ever plugged in something and seen that little UL thing on it? They were hit by ransomware. So it's important for you to keep an eye out. Nearly everywhere you can find cybersecurity news. Go look at that so you can get a feel for what's going on, who's getting hit, what's being used, who the threat actors are, etc. The interesting thing that I saw here, let's see if I can find it. They were victims of 6 ransomware groups. 290 companies were hit by 6 ransomware groups. So, and there's more than 6 out there. Okay, so some of these reports come from the industry themselves. If you remember, President Biden enacted new cybersecurity reporting, an executive order, I believe, that said if you do business with the federal government, which is most everybody these days, if you do business with the federal government and you have been the product or the victim of a cybersecurity attack of any sort, you're required to report it. Now, they're still developing that reporting framework, but the writing is on the wall. You can no longer hide behind secrecy and say, well, it just affects us. No, it affects everybody. All right, so be aware of that. Chris, anything before I finish with ransomware?
Nope, nailed it all.
Okay, all right, cool. So the next thing I wanted to do is talk about frameworks. For a lot of people that, it's like, uh-oh, time to nod off. But frameworks are important for us to think about. And like I was saying in our announcement, if you have well, in this case, it's the Security Plus Study Guide, you look in here and it talks about the NIST CyberSecurity Framework, okay? And it talks about laws and regulations, and then it describes some of those here in the book. The important thing to remember is these are based on, usually, frameworks, all right? And we'll talk about the difference between a law, a regulation, a policy, a standard, and a framework, okay? So, oh, sorry, just lost my coffee mug. So, what is a framework? What's the big deal about frameworks? You may have heard about them. Well, you just did with NIST CyberSecurity Framework. But why is a framework such a big deal? Why is a framework such a big deal? And, of course, the big question, if I'm in a particular industry or corporation or consulting for a particular group, they're going to ask me, well, there's lots of frameworks out there. Which one is best for us? And I'll describe a little bit about that as well. Here's my quote, okay, because I couldn't find a good quote. A framework is a written set of information that, when followed fully, allows you to apply a comprehensive principle or program. In other words, a framework is designed to be a beginning to end description of a program or a principle or a set of procedures. It is information. It's important for you to understand about a framework. It's information. Now, a lot of people may ask, where have frameworks been established? And I went out and looked, and there are lots of them. There's one for enterprise architecture, etc. But there are ones that are closer to us. If any of you have been in IT for any period of time, you are probably aware of ITIL, ITIL, and the other less known part of ITIL called ISO 20000. I'll talk about that as we go. But have you ever driven along past like the John Deere assembly plant or whatever, and you see right across the side of the building it says, "We are proud to be an ISO 9000 quality implementer," or something like that. ISO is different than a framework, but ISO is a set of standards that you can implement, and then you can claim that you now meet the specifications in that standard. Okay? So a standard begins with a framework. ITIL is a framework. ISO 20000 is a standard, okay? And then, of course, cybersecurity. NIST has the cybersecurity framework, which we will discuss. Now, the important thing to remember is the framework is thorough. It's supposed to be comprehensive. And you can implement something, and once you're done with it, you can say you've done so. The challenge, I heard it described as a roadmap. Where do I need to go? How do I get there, etc. The challenge you'll run into with a framework is a framework does not specify specific steps. It does not specify specific achievements, and it doesn't specify particular controls to verify that the steps have been implemented. All right, so be careful. When you're talking about a framework, think about it as the roadmap, but not necessarily your, I'll say roadmap, but it's not Waze that says turn left, turn right. A framework doesn't have turn left, turn right. Okay? Chris, any comments on that before we go on?
Nothing from my end.
Okay. All right. Frameworks are informational. But frameworks, one more thing about frameworks. They do change. They do change. For example, even ISO, I think it originally was 91, then they said 9,000 or whatever for quality. When they implemented it, they implemented it based on very, very specific understanding, and over time their understanding was sort of changed based on the inclusion of more industries into the quality framework. So the quality framework had to shift itself a little bit because it started off, if any of you are familiar with Deming started the idea of quality, but he was not the originator of the quality approach. Can anybody tell me where our modern day idea of a quality approach began? Okay.
I'm going to say Toyota.
Very good. It began in Japan with their heavy industries, which included Toyota and Fuji Heavy Industries. Quality was based on manufacturing, if you think about it. And it began in Japan with a concept called Kaizen, K-A-I-Z-E-N in English, which means continual improvement, continual re-examination. And so that is what Deming, after World War II, Deming was one of the people, one of the engineers who was sent to Japan to help rebuild their industries after the war, and they implemented Kaizen, and Deming made it a little simpler and called it quality, and then brought it back to the U.S. And a lot of the things that were implemented originally with Japan became the foundation for America's ISO 9000 or 91 originally. So the frameworks do change. If you have implemented a framework, or you think you've implemented a framework, or you believe you're following a particular framework, you can expect that that framework is not going to remain entirely static because the industries change. Think about manufacturing and then the implementation of GPS tracking, worldwide tracking of your supply chain. That didn't exist before, except maybe with phone calls, teletypes. Oh, the train just went past us, or those sorts of things. But nowadays, they literally have GPS trackers on important cargo ships or containers or rail cars or even trucks that are traveling around. You can GPS track where your supply is and when it's going to arrive at your loading dock. Big deal. but that didn't exist back in the past. So a framework will change based on advancements in the industries. Here's something that helps you understand what's the difference between a framework and a policy, or a framework and a standard. A framework just contains information. You probably should do this. You probably should have this. Once you do this, you probably should do this. It's recommended that you, we suggest that you, etc. It never says you must. A framework cannot specify a mandate. That's important to remember. And now there are some exceptions, like it says in the first bullet, ITIL. The ITIL, which is called the IT Infrastructure Library, it's now up to version 4. I was trained in ITIL version 3 way back in 2007. I got my first ITIL certification. But the important thing for ITIL is that ITIL is a framework. But how do you get certified in ITIL? Well, ITIL is wholly owned by a subsidiary of the British government. And so they can say, we have established evaluation criteria, we've established training, we've established certifications that once you pass through this and pass this certification exam, by the way, you have to pay us to do it. Once you pass this certification exam, you can say that you are ITIL certified. Well, in the federal government, U.S. federal government, they found ITIL to be so valuable that they started to specify, for example, within IT services contracts, that if you are bidding on an IT services contract for a contract within the federal government, you must specify that you are ITIL, you're following ITIL best practices, and here's the mandate, and your key personnel are ITIL certified. That's a requirement that says ITIL, but it's not a requirement within ITIL. The federal government says that ITIL is so good that if you are doing business with us and you want to contract with us, your key personnel will be ITIL certified. See the difference? A standard is more in the implementation and day-to-day operation of a particular discipline. In this case, ITIL version 3, or now ITIL version 4, what somebody did is they took ITIL and they said, how do we know we've implemented it properly? This will occur, this will be found, this will be able to be measured, series of measurements, standards, etc. So they took ITIL version, I think ITIL version 3, and established what's called ISO 20000, which I call, this is the way I describe it in my mind, it's ITIL with teeth. In other words, you can say, if you haven't done this particular step, you have not implemented ISO 20000, period. So ITIL is easier to implement because you just say, we send our people to training, and they get certified, and so you come back and you say, we're ITIL v3 certified. Our people are ITIL certified. ISO 20000 is what you implement at the corporate level to say we have implemented the standards that are specified in ISO 20000. Okay, so that's just a really good example. If any of you have an opportunity, if you're working for a company or whatever, and they offer you the opportunity to attend ITIL training, I strongly recommend you do so, because I had somebody, and this was just many years ago, I was interviewing somebody for a position in the help desk for the Secretary of Defense. This was the highest help desk in DoD, and I was the program manager for that. And I was interviewing this young, and I mean she was in her early 20s, individual who was coming over from Department of Homeland Security. She had just been supporting the Homeland Security front office, and she was applying for a job and interviewing for a job at the home office, if you will, for the Department of Defense in the Pentagon. And I noted in this resume that this person had ITIL V3 certification. And I said, that's really curious. I usually don't see ITIL certification until people start getting up into the higher levels where they are team leads and managers, because that's where the government specifies you must have it. So I asked her, I said, you have ITIL certification? And she said, yes, I do. And I said, why? I said, oh, I also said, do you like ITIL? Because a lot of people, they get ITIL, they don't know why, their company told them to, but they go get ITIL certified. I said, do you like ITIL? She said, oh, yes. And then I said, why? In other words, it was a very open-ended question, because ITIL, again, is suggestions. It's never you must do this. It's just how to do certain things. It doesn't say what the steps are. So I talked to her and I said, why do you like ITIL? And she thought about it for a second, and I love this so much. I talk about it a lot. She said, it tells me what I don't do. In other words, it allows you to understand where you fit into the framework of IT, where your job fits in the overall framework. Because there are certain things that your job will do, and there are certain things that your job absolutely won't do. So she pointed out, ITIL tells me where I'm at in the particular thing that we call IT. And I thought it was a wonderful description. It tells me what I don't do. And yes, I hired her on the spot. So anyway, you're talking about what policies or frameworks or standards or whatever. Typically, a framework precedes a policy or a standard, because you can't establish a standard if you don't know what you're trying to establish. Somebody says in a framework, oh, this happens and then this happens and then this happens. So the standard says you must do this and then this and then this. But it began with an idea, a concept, a framework. All right? It's not easy to implement a framework. If anybody says that they have implemented ITIL, be careful, because they may not fully understand what they're describing. Now, if they say they have implemented ISO 20000, you can say, show me your certification papers, because somebody actually has to come in from an external corporation and review everything that you've done to say, yes, you are ISO 20000 certified, for example. Okay? So, in some cases, a framework such as ITIL V3 or V4 is specified as part of a contract. That's what I told you about, that says all of your key personnel must be ITIL certified. It says that in IT services contracts throughout the federal government. So, if you're thinking about being a contractor for the federal government and you want to be a key personnel, the important thing to think about for key personnel is they get paid more. Then ITIL is a good thing for you to go out and get certified in. All right? Any questions before we go on? Any questions?
I took the ITIL exam before, and I agree with the young lady that you interviewed with, Scotty. It's where you are in that piece of that big IT world. And she nailed it hard on the head of, this is what you do and this is what you not do. And when I took the ITIL, I totally understood where I was in OCIL right after that, and then everything just picked up like boom.
Right. Right. Many, many years ago, and I'll talk about my ITIL experience. When I was first trained in ITIL version 3. I sat in a room full of people. There were probably 8 or 10 of us, and most of them were sort of like sitting in the back like this. I'm here because my boss says I have to be here, literally. And you'd go through, and the teacher, who was an ITIL expert, one of the first 200, I believe, in the United States, he was teaching us, and a framework, and in this case ITIL, it's general. It doesn't say you must do this, you must do this, you must do this. And so these guys were like, yeah, sure, of course. Yeah, of course. Well, no, because over where we work, this is how we do it. And these guys were just continually fighting against this instructor who is an ITIL expert. They were like, no, that's not how we do it where we are. Well, guess what? It will be. The closer and closer you get to, in this case, the federal government, you've got to be ITIL. You've got to follow the ITIL framework, and you've got to state that you're doing so. And I have been in meetings where somebody says, "Yeah, we're all ITIL v3. We're following the procedures," and the federal government manager will say, "That's junk. You're lying to me because you're doing this, but you're not doing this. You don't have what ITIL says you should have. You're not doing ITIL. You're lying to me." So, yeah, when all of these guys were sitting around going, I don't know why I'm here, I was listening to this guy, and I said, ooh, I know why ITIL is where it is in the IT industry, and here are the next things that we need to do. And this guy this expert looked at me, and he said, I'm on a working group to do that right now. And I'm like, I got this. I understand. I've been doing IT for 32 years. So when they started to describe it to me, I was like, yeah, this makes sense. This makes sense. This makes sense. And the other guys in the room were like, I'm only here because my boss told me I have to be, and we don't do it that way. Dude, you're destined for a crash. Just be careful, So it's important to remember that frameworks are there to help, and they do not mandate that you do certain things. That's when a framework turns into a standard, all right? And a standard becomes a policy. So let's talk about the NIST CyberSecurity Framework. Here's the page for it, nist.gov/cyberframework. And it talks about, and you notice it says version 1.1. That means that there was a 1.0. Remember I said frameworks change. ITIL is now up to version 4. It used to be version 1, then version 2, then version 3. Now it's version 4. So frameworks will change. But it says identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. And that is, I'm going to shift over to the NIST page, and this is the cybersecurity framework. If you click on framework, it sort of talks about it. And it says, how do I get started? Where can I learn more about it? Well, here's online learning for it. If you want to have a discussion, here's 1.0 for the cybersecurity framework. But the other thing that I found, let me find it, informative resources, I think that was it. Nope. Let me back up. Whoops. Let me back up. And it wasn't informative resources. Maybe it's resources. No. Getting started. Quick start guide. There you go. Direction and guidance. How do I get started in the cybersecurity framework? And one other thing to remember, if you are working on a framework, you can't just work on one piece of it. If you are reading about a framework and you are deciding that your organization needs to implement a framework, you have to read through the entire thing. Remember I said in my definition, it's a comprehensive definition. All right? So be aware that you can't just say, we do this for ITIL or we do this for cybersecurity. Remember that, and if you look at the framework, let me go back to the slide then. If you look at the framework, it's a continuum. All right? You can't just have one piece of the pie and say you have the pie. So you have to learn what it means when it says identify, what it means when it says protect, what it means when it says detect, respond, recover. That's all part of the cybersecurity framework. You can't just say, hey, we've done identify. No such way of doing that. Okay? Trying to find that. If you look under frequently asked questions, it says, what is a framework? What's it designed to accomplish? So you can learn what the cybersecurity framework was designed to do. Here's another one. Does it provide a recommended checklist of what organizations should, keyword, should do? Probably. The framework is guidance. It should be customized by different sectors to best suit their risk situation and needs. So you say, does it have a checklist? No. It's a framework. On that framework, you build your cybersecurity program. But you don't just implement the framework. As you are going through your cybersecurity implementation, you look back frequently to the framework and say, have we neglected to do a particular portion of this? In other words, I'll give you a good example. We had 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago now, we started off a cybersecurity sensei session with me asking a question. And I said, Chris, you may remember this one. If you can do one thing to strengthen your organization's cybersecurity posture, what would you do? If you could do one thing, and I wanted people to bring it down to not just this big, massive cybersecurity. It's so big, I don't know, how I'm going to do this all, et cetera, et cetera. You can get lost because of the immensity of it. But I said, if you can do one thing today, what would you do? And one of the first things that the mentees came up with, the first thing they thought of was new tools. Buy new software, get the best firewall software or intrusion detection system or whatever. They immediately thought about what advertisers are telling them about the industry. Why are the advertisers doing it? Because they want to sell you the closest thing they can come up with to a full solution. So naturally, we lean where the advertisers tell us to lean and say, new tools. Chris, do you remember what my wife said?
Implement two-factor authentication, if I remember correctly. No,
even simpler. Even simpler.
She did say something. I can't remember.
Yeah. My wife was literally walking behind me when this was going on, and she nailed it. She just turned and she said, make sure everything's patched.
Yes.
Duh. Obviously she was spot on. Sometimes you start thinking about advanced things and you forget, is my computer patched? Is it up to date on the software and tools that it needs to defend itself today? We already have the software, but is the software up to date? beautiful explanation of the simplicity about cybersecurity and yet the complexity of it. A lot of people were like, new tools, new tools, new tools. Now, multi-factor authentication is absolutely one of the first things that should be implemented, Chris, absolutely. But I brought it down to if you could do it today, rather than this big new, MFA is frequently a multi-year effort. So my wife just said, make sure everything's up to date. Bingo, she was right on. So when we talk about frameworks, frameworks are just if you think about it, back when we were kids, we used to have those big things out in the playground called monkey bars. There's this big bunch of pipes. They didn't look like anything unless they were shaped to look like something. But if you put pieces of flat, let's say cardboard over all of those empty spaces, it would form something, a shape, like a square bottom with a smaller square on top. It's the one that I remember the most. Well, that's what a framework does, is it tells you sort of where you can get started, where you can, make sure that you are working on certain things, and you aren't done until you've done it all. Okay, and there was one other thing that I wanted to, and I didn't find it when I was looking, but there is a presentation, an actual PowerPoint presentation talking about the NIST CyberSecurity Framework. I didn't find it, sorry, I was trying to go straight to it, but it's out there. And it basically said, for example, 3 primary components, desired cybersecurity outcomes. Now that doesn't say things you must do, but it basically says when you get there, you're going to be able to say, have we reached this outcome? Yes or no. Profiles, alignment of your requirements and objectives, making sure you take into account your risk appetite. Can anybody describe risk appetite? Risk appetite. We've never discussed it here, and yet I'm sure it's in our discussion. Chris, what do you think of when you think of risk appetite?
It's how much you're willing to accept a risk event.
Very good. Absolutely perfect. Risk appetite, it's sort of an overall concept of, is your organization risk averse? In other words, we must avoid risk at all costs? Or are you sort of more robust where you say a certain level of risk is acceptable? And also, when you look at the acceptation of risks, you also have to consider what's the likelihood and what's the cost, as well as what is the impact if a risk becomes an event. For example, if we are in, let's say, the automotive industry, and we're coming up with this new whatever thing that we're going to implement across all of our cars, a new anti-lock brake system or something like that, and it is intellectual property. It's protected by copyrights, and nobody else can do this except us. But what happens if somebody steals our copyrights? Next thing you know, Ford's doing it, General Motors is doing it, Toyota's doing it, Kia Hyundai is doing it, etc. So, how important is it for us to protect this intellectual property? If it is the foundation of what we do, it's really important. So we need to be able to spend lots of money so that we can make sure this never goes out to somebody else. That's your risk appetite. And it depends entirely on your company as well as the industry in which you find yourself. So risk appetite, good thing to, maybe we'll have a whole thing on risk appetite. I think it might be helpful for us. And then implementation, it says it is a qualitative measure of cybersecurity risk management practices. You notice it didn't say it is a checklist, it is a series of standards. It didn't say that. It's a measure. All right, so always remember, a framework doesn't have teeth, for lack of a better way of describing it. So the principles of the attributes of the cybersecurity framework. Common and accessible language. By the way, that was what I had told my ITIL expert back in 2007 that we were still lacking. And guess what? Here it is. It's acceptable to many technologies, life cycle, phases, sectors, and uses. In other words, this is not just IT. Cybersecurity could be done by a fertilizer company. Okay, cybersecurity. It's based on risk, and again, the risk appetite. How risk robust are we? How risk averse are we? How will we be affected if a particular risk occurs, etc. And living document, remember I said frameworks are subject to constant change by re-evaluation. And again, it's guided by many perspectives. ITIL was guided solely by IT practitioners and IT governance authorities. Not so for cybersecurity. Okay? And then I'm just going to say here are the 5 parts of the framework. And again, it's supposed to allow you to read and implement a thorough cybersecurity framework. The problem you get into is once you get past here, you start getting into some very specific and very broad and very complex descriptions. For protect, for example, it's within identity management, authentication, and access control. If you look in here, it's called Identity Access and Management, or IDAM. Here's where that fits. Protect fits into IDAM. And then it says, identities are proofed and bound to credentials and asserted in interactions. How does one object get access to another? Through a credentialing and access permission system. It doesn't say you have to implement Active Directory. Remember, it's just a framework. And then it says another part, users' devices and other assets are authenticated, commensurate with the risk of the transaction. If it is a credit card transaction, there is a higher level of risk, so it has to have higher levels of protections. For example, as compared to how do I sign into my phone? All right? So just recognize that there are lots of things in here. It's helpful to read it, and it's helpful to learn about it because your bosses are going to be thinking along the lines of the exact same thing here, the NIST CyberSecurity Framework. Right now, there, as I understand it, there may be acknowledgments of NIST, but there are no requirements to implement NIST. The main reason is it's still a framework. It has not turned into a series of standards and implementation guidelines and checklists and controls and training, etc. NIST is still kind of new. It's only like 4 years old. So back in the day, they used to have NIST Security, which was 800-36, I believe. But it has been overtaken by this one, which I think is 800-141 or something. So if you did, well, again, this is how the cybersecurity framework came about. Looks like an executive order, a law, and another executive order. So they have said you have to, you industry have to get better. Here's how you need to get better. and we're going to allow NIST to describe what better looks like. From end to end. Remember, it's from end to end. It's not, do I have to have this particular checklist? That's only a fraction of what you need to implement if you're thinking about the NIST CyberSecurity Framework. Chris.
I was going to say the reason why it's not a required checklist is you want the businesses to be able to use it within to do their own business and not be restrictive. And if we go way back to the CIA triad, you want all three to be equal as possible to have the best security in the world.
Right.
But at the same time, there's challenges to keep all three of those in a balance. If you are so restrictive that you can't do business, what's the point of security? I mean, we could just unplug our wires and go back to pen and paper.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, it's all right. I've been doing enough talking.
The reason why these checklists is not to say, hey, you do this and you're going to be 100% secure. You can do everything on that checklist and you're still going to get hit. That's just the way of life. Exactly. And what the framework says is these are the best practices. If you do these best practices, your risk is going to go significantly, is going to lower. That's what the purpose of that framework is.
Yep. And also frameworks are evolving. Excuse me. Because I've been part of companies that basically say, we have to get this certification. We have to become ISO 20000 certified. So they say, what's the minimum amount of things that we need to do to become ISO 20000 certified? And then they get certified and they say, we are ISO 20000 certified. And then everything that they've done starts to age because they did a great big effort to get that certification so they could say, yes, we can compete on this contract. But then are they actually doing it? They paid all the money to implement this program, and then, and I've seen this happen, 3 years later, when the program has to be recertified, they bring out all their old stuff and they go, okay, what do we need to do to get recertified? In other words, they marked a checkbox that says, yep, we got it, but it did not become part of their ethos. They didn't, make it part of how they do business. And that's another thing. Standards are constantly being redone. Well, look at CompTIA Security Plus. CompTIA Security Plus, way back in the day, used to be certification for life. If you got Security Plus, you were considered certified for life. And then the International Standards Organization contacted CompTIA and said, that's probably not a very good approach because you're sending people into the industry who have dated information with your certification. And so CompTIA went, ooh, you're right. So then CompTIA implemented a requirement that every 3 years you have to be recertified, or you do progressive information and training throughout those 3 years. So at the end of 3 years, you can say, I've had this much training or this much independent study or whatever, and you can keep your certification. Otherwise, your certification expires.
Another thing about frameworks is they're there as high suggestions, but if you don't do it, that risk goes significantly up. My example, I'll be vague on purpose, not going to name names. There's a certain piece of software that our security said, get it off our systems or we're not going to be happy with you. Or that's strong language is the best way I can put it. We have our customers going, we're not ready to take this off yet. We're not sure what we're going to use to replace it and all that. Those are challenges of being in a framework and being strict into that framework. But that's part of the job of that framework is to make you talk about it, make you think about it. That's
right. One last thing, and you are right on target, Chris. What that then does, it continues the risk. And what you need to do is make sure that the highest level of person necessary is aware of the risk and accepts that risk. It's called risk acceptance. And if they're aware of it and they accept it in writing, that yes, it's okay for this to be here, and I do understand the risks involved, and then there's a compromise, well, that person's in trouble because they accepted the risk. It's your job to help make sure they know enough to make an informed decision. Yeah, that's typically the ISSO that says, you know, we really shouldn't do this. It's not a good idea. I don't care who's complaining. If something happens, we're dead in the water. Let's not, you know. And then the managers have meetings where they throw things at each other. It's up to them. Yeah. So anyway, any last minute words on the NIST CyberSecurity Framework? Harminder, anything?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Good to see you here today, by the way. Okay. That's it for today. Thanks, everybody, for participating. And I hope that this helps you on your cyber journeys.